Have you ever wondered what the inside of a volcano looks like? Well, I have some good news for you. There's a guy who's made it his life's work to find out. His name is George Kelling, and he's a geologist. But more specifically, he's a volcanologist, which means he studies volcanoes. And not just any volcanoes, active volcanoes. In 1974, George became obsessed with Mount St. Helens in Washington state. He wanted to understand what had caused the eruption and what the inside of the volcano looked like. So he did something crazy. He built a device that shot steel balls into the volcano at high speeds. And then he recorded the sounds they made as they bounced around inside. After a year of studying the data, he and his team created a map of the volcano's inner surface. And it turns out the walls are really rough and uneven, kind of like a honeycomb. The steel ball experiment was just one small part of an even bigger research project called the Volcano Research Unit, which was funded by the National Science Foundation and lasted from 1974 to 1985. So, dim the lights, fluff up your pillow, maybe get yourself a chamomile tea or, if you're feeling historically accurate, a lukewarm mug of watered-down Aland. Let's drift together into the weird, forgotten world of the medieval executioner's wife. Now, I know what you're thinking. Executioner's wife? Really? Of all the glamorous titles in medieval Europe, queen, duchess, abbess, one doesn't exactly sparkle. Nobody daydreams as a little girl spinning wool in a smoky cottage, whispering to herself, "Someday I'll marry a man who chops off heads for a living." But hey, history's not here to give us fairy tales. History is here to remind us that someone had to do the weird jobs, and someone else had to marry them. And the wives of executioners were not just any someones. They were often the daughters of aristocrats, the king's relatives, sometimes even the king himself. Because in the Middle Ages, being an executioner was a prestigious job with a hefty paycheck and a whole lot of perks. Not to mention the thrill of being up close and personal with the royal family, literally chopping their heads off. Want to know more about the perks of being an executioner's wife? Meet the weird wives of Europe's executioners. So let's take a nice, sleepy glide into their world. Who these women were, how they lived, what they had to put up with, and why their marriages are one of the strangest little footnotes in Europe as long. Dysfunctional story. First, a bit of context. Executioners in medieval Europe were not exactly the kind of guys you wanted to bump into at your village bake sale. Their whole profession carried a deep, sticky stigma. It wasn't just about swinging an axe or tying a noose. It was about handling blood, touching corpses, and getting far too cozy with the messy business of human mortality. But where there's smoke, there's fire. And in this case, there's also a whole lot of axes. Medieval executioners were frequently hired as local butchers, meaning they were intimately familiar with all things sharp and pointy. They weren't allowed to be married, which did unstop them from shacking up with a select few women who took their vows as seriously as the church did their profession. What? For more, check out the series in the description. In a world where people are obsessed with purity, religious rituals, and not touching anything unclean because that would doom your soul forever, the executioner was basically the human embodiment of that one weird uncle everyone avoids at family gatherings. Necessary, but deeply awkward. So of course, the stigma didn't just stick to him. Oh no. His wife, his children, his cousins, even his chickens were all tainted by association. You weren't just Anna, married to Hans, the executioner. You were Anna, who clearly had some sort of moral problem. If she was married to Hans, the executioner, and that label was nearly impossible to wash off. This is why, in a world where everyone is trying to be pure, the executioner's wife was the original sinner. Why do executioners marry other executioners? In this world, marriage wasn't exactly romantic. It was pragmatic. If you were the daughter of an executioner, your options were limited. You couldn't just go to the castle and marry the local knight. The villagers would whisper. The church would side-eye you. So in a cruel twist of medieval logic, most executioners ended up marrying other executioners. Whole dynasties of head-chopping families emerged, generation after generation, locked in a social ghetto of blood-stained reputations. And that means, yes, The wives of executioners were usually either the daughters of other executioners or women who had fallen so low on the social ladder that marrying into this profession was their only option. So, yeah, romance wasn't really a thing. Welcome to my channel. Let us float over to daily life, because here's the thing. These women were unjust sitting around, sewing pretty embroidery while their husbands went off to work with an axe. No, their lives were equally shaped by this weird profession in both practical and social ways. For starters, executioners often doubled as skilled healers, so you're saying that being an executioner was like being a doctor in medieval times? Well, kind of. But there was one major difference. People didn't go to executioners for surgery. They went to them for a leech. And who do you think was helping with the herbs and the ointments and the washing of bandages? That's right, the wife suddenly. She wasn't just the executioner's wife. She was also a kind of shadow nurse, an unofficial midwife, sometimes even a back alley apothecary. All while still being the social pariah no one wanted to sit next to in church. Oh yes, about church. Executioners and their families were usually assigned a special pew. Not a good pew. Not even a middle-of-the-road pew. We're talking the pew equivalent of sitting behind a pillar where you can't see anything. A sort of permanent timeout chair for the untouchables. People needed them, but didn't want to be seen with them. The wives bore the brunt of this. Imagine going to market. You're buying onions. You're minding your own business. And suddenly, the stallholder says, "Sure, but please put the coins down on the table. Don't hand them to me directly. I don't want to touch you." Day after day, week after week. You can see how bitterness might quietly seep into the bones. And yet the irony, the thing that makes this whole story both tragic and a little absurd, is that executioners' wives often lived materially better than their neighbors. Because here's the kicker, executioners were actually paid pretty well. Cities needed their services. Justice had to be carried out, and the law was only as scary as the man who could enforce it with a big sharp blade. So towns paid their executioners good wages, gave them free housing, sometimes even free beer. Yes, free beer. Because what says thank you for decapitating criminals on our behalf, like a few pints on the house? That meant their wives had nicer clothes, a bigger hearth, maybe even a few luxury goods. Things that the poor peasants could only dream of, but none of it bought them respect. They were like the nouveau rich of the medieval underworld. Comfortable, but untouchable, richer than some, despised by all. You ever wonder what it would be like to be the daughter of an executioner? Well, don't. It was awful. As the daughter of the town executioner, you're not allowed to play with the other children. You're shunned at festivals. And if you dare to flirt with a boy at the midsummer dance, his mother will drag him away, as if you're carrying the plague. Your own mother, the executioner's wife, will have to console you at home. All while knowing that your marriage prospects are grim. Being an executioner's wife meant being a partner in the business, a manager of stigma, a damage control specialist, an emotional shock absorber for the entire family. It was exhausting work, but someone had to do it. And sometimes, when the executioners died, their widows were expected to step in and do the job themselves, until a new official could be appointed. There are actual records of executioner women throughout history. Women who took the axe in hand to keep their family's profession alive. What do you do when your dad is the executioner? You're born into a life of infamy. Your whole world is shrouded in the shadow of your father's profession. People will always whisper behind your back, "Don't trust them. They're the executioner's family." And because of that stigma, your options are limited. You might think, well, they could have just married someone else, someone outside of that world. But no, not really. Not in those days. In small towns, the stigma was airtight. If your father was an executioner, you were trapped in that world. The only people who would accept you were others like you. So executioner families ended up forming these strange little hereditary clans, passing down the tools of the trade, along with the stigma, generation after generation. There's something quietly tragic about that, isn't it? Just the idea that you're born into a life where your fate is already sealed. Not because of your own actions, but because of your father's profession, and your mother, an executioner's wife, is the silent witness to it all. One particularly eerie detail about executioners is that their families live right outside the city walls, close enough to rush in and help out whenever the job required it, but far enough away that the good, respectable citizens didn't have to see them every day. These little houses on the margins became both home and prison. The wives decorated their hearths, cooked their meals, raised their children, all within a bubble of permanent exclusion. But many of them carved out small niches of dignity. See, when you're already half shunned by society, you might as well help out the other half shunned women giving birth in secret. That's how many of these women became skilled midwives, and some became quiet experts in herbal medicine, their knowledge passed down in whispers from mother to daughter. They were feared, but they were also needed, which is the most medieval thing ever. Let's float one more time to the bigger picture. Kings and queens, they come and go. Battles are fought and won. But in between times, life goes on. And for the people who lived it, life was never very glamorous. Take, for example, the executioner's wife. Herself the daughter of an executioner, she married the man with the biggest axe in town. Someone had to do it, and so she became the enforcer of the law, alongside her husband, the executioner. Now, their days were probably pretty quiet, spent mostly mending clothes and sharpening axes. But in the market square, when people saw the couple, they'd turn and point and whisper, because to be an executioner's wife meant that you were tainted, forever carrying the blood of the innocent on your hands. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine a candlelit room outside the city walls. A woman in a simple wool dress, mending clothes by the fire. Her husband sharpening his axe in the corner. The children asleep on straw pallets. The town alive with the sounds of hammers and tongs. But no one will knock on their door. They are the forgotten people.